Hello YouTube, this is Sadako24 here, and we are fast approaching the end at last of Jodie Whittaker's era of Doctor Who. I'm sure many of us will be glad that it is soon going to finally be all over. And I thought in this video I would share some of my thoughts on the current era and what it has meant for the fan base, what it has meant for the franchise. When Jodie was announced as the first female Doctor, it was something I never expected would happen. I thought they would never change the Doctor's gender. I thought the Doctor would always be a male character. So it was a shock. I thought they would never go there. But it was kind of one of those moments where I kind of realised I'm past caring anyway. Because at that point, we were quite deep into the Peter Capaldi era, and for much of that era, my interest in the show had been waning anyway. I was losing interest. And then, as I got closer to Jodie's air date, I began to think that it was only fair to give Jodie a chance, like any other Doctor. Jodie's first episode was The Woman Who Fell to Earth, and to be honest, as a starter to her era, it wasn't bad. It was a fairly decent episode. It was okay. Then there was The Ghost Monument, which was not very good. That was a rather dumb episode. And then, of course, there was Rosa, which I have to say the period stuff in Rosa was quite good. Jodie and her fam were an annoyance, and so was the time-travelling racist villain. I thought that really dragged the episode down for me. And the problem, of course, is Rosa. That made it very, very hard to take Rosa as a story half as seriously as the story wanted you to. And then Arachnids in the UK happened, and that was kind of where it finally hit me that Chibnall did not have a clue what he was doing, or what he was trying to say, but he was still going to, whatever he was trying to say, he was determined to say it very, very loudly. And that's where I just lost faith completely. I mean, I looked in on the show occasionally after, but I wasn't really watching it regularly. It wasn't very compelling as far as I could tell. Obviously, that was echoed by a lot of other viewers who felt the show was just rubbish now. And, some had given Jodie a chance, and likewise they felt, okay, this is not good. If Jodie's first season was all we'd gotten, then I think the show would still be in a much more salvageable state today. It would be far more salvageable. But then Series 12 happened, and we got the Timeless Children retcon. Now, I didn't actually watch the Timeless Children. I've not watched it to this day. To be honest, the only Series 12 episode I've watched is Orphan 55, and that was bad enough. So I just couldn't watch any more after that. I kind of knew what was going to happen in the Timeless Children. I'd heard rumblings. I knew what was coming, and I just refused to watch it. I thought, well, I'm going to spare myself that. I'm not going to bother watching it. But, a lot of people did see it, and they saw the entire lore of the show get demolished in 45 minutes. The Doctor's origins completely rewritten. Like a lot of fans, it killed it for them. It's like that was where the show became unsalvageable. Like I said, I was mostly out of the picture. I wasn't really engaging in the show anymore. If you ask me, has there been anything about Jodie's era I've liked from what I've seen of it? I did think Resolution was a fairly fun New Year's Day special. Revolution of the Daleks, very dumb story, but it had some fun bits. It had some very, very... It felt like Doctor Who a lot more than much of the rest of Jodie's era has. Flux Part 1 was pretty good. I remember enjoying that one. That's all I've really liked from the era, is just about 2 or 3 stories. And the rest is just, not very good at all, and some of it's just painful. Now, during this time, during lockdown, me and a friend called Graham set up this forum between us called the Auton Factory, because we thought, well, look, if you go on a forum like Gallifrey Base, it is completely sycophantic to the new series, and it's completely sycophantic to Jodie. And we thought, what, we'll create a forum of our own, which is going to be better. It's going to be where people can say what they want about the new series. They can... And I thought, well, I'd like to kind of cultivate on this forum a very nostalgic forum, a forum that's kind of less about complaining about the current era and more about reappreciating how good the show was in the 1970s. It's basically a forum more about our journey as fans, and we know where it's ended for the show. We know it's ended up in this terrible state, but let's talk about the journey of how we were fans at one point. And I thought it'd be great. The problem is, we couldn't really compete with Gallifrey Base, which I know think, well, of course you can't compete with Gallifrey Base. The thing is, Gallifrey Base is one of the few forums out there these days that is thriving, that is, very populated, huge kind of membership. It's one of the few forums out there that's not become a ghost town of late. Because a lot of forums did become ghost towns over the years. Because obviously Discord and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter came along and they offered much more instantaneous interactions. They became more the hub of fan interaction. Forums less so. People don't really bother with forums as much as they used to. Unless, of course, like Gallifrey Base, it's a huge news source. And if it's not, then I imagine even Gallifrey Base is probably not what it used to be. It's a shadow of its former self, probably. But most forums, they're not what they used to be. And starting up a forum from the ground up was next to impossible. We had a lot of problems, probably made a lot of mistakes along the way, but it just wasn't really happening. I do think fan enthusiasm has taken a major knock, and that, I think, did have a huge impact on our forum, where people just weren't contributing. People didn't really have the heart in the show that they used to. I spoke to Graham one day, and he said to me there'd been this podcast he'd listened to with Nerdrotic and Bolstrek on there, and one of them had said that they felt really awful about the show, and what they wanted to do, what they decided they were going to do, I think it might have been Bolstrek who said this, it might have been Nerdrotic. They said, I want to just take all my memorabilia from the show, all the stuff I've collected over the years, I want to put it in a loft and forget about it for a few years and return to it years later when I'm maybe feeling better about the show, because at the moment, the show's ruined, the fan base is a horrible place, it's full of SJWs who will not allow you to have an opinion without giving you a really, really hard time over it. I have only bitter feelings towards the show now and the fan base. And Graham was saying to me, I feel the same way. He said that, I feel like doing the same. I think it's probably a good idea. And I even said to Blue Bonnet one day, I said, well, Blue Bonnet kind of said similar to me when, as I was saying to her, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong with this forum. I'm trying to get this forum off the ground, and it's not happening. And she said, well, actually, I think you've got a good forum. The problem is it's a good forum at the wrong time. It's a good forum at a time when fandom just feels really bitter about the show and disillusioned in the show, and they feel like it's all tainted for them. And she was saying to me, I'd like to post on your forum, but it's an effort for me now. I have to make an effort to write something positive about the show now, because it's so tainted. And this is kind of, this is why I'm glad I've never seen The Timeless Children, because I don't have that problem. I can watch, classic Doctor Who and not think of that. But a lot of fans can't. And, in fact, during lockdown, I enjoyed revisiting Classic Who a hell of a lot. I enjoyed doing the watch-alongs where we rewatched The Demons and Terror of the Zygons and Remembrance of the Daleks. I've really loved revisiting the show during lockdown. I've loved it. I've enjoyed the show probably more in 2020 than I ever did than I have since I was 11 or 12. But for a lot of fans, it's the opposite. And I think that's kind of why the forum didn't take off. Like when Chibnall cast Jodie, he honestly said that he felt that if he'd not done that, the show was at risk of looking like it had been left behind. Which struck me as very odd because, it wasn't that long ago that David Tennant was a really popular, beloved Doctor that the nation adored. They adored him as the Doctor. And it's like, has society suddenly changed so much that all those people who adored him now are going to be like, oh God, not another man as the Doctor. We don't want another man as the Doctor. I just don't really buy that. But he said, well, look, it's politics are changing, and Jodie herself, when she was cast, she'd not really researched the role much. I mean, she'd probably watched some David Tennant, like a lot of the nation did. But she hadn't really researched the role. But she did, when she talked about it, she gave off what was tended to be the general media consensus about the classic show, which was that it was like all old shows, it was a bit chauvinistic, it was a bit retrograde. And she said like it was a show that celebrated the white male gaze. Presumably she means like when she said that she was talking generally. That's what old shows were like. And Doctor Who was probably no different. But I think for a lot of fans, this was a horrible moment where it's like, oh dear, now the show is actually being run by people who despise it. These people, they despise the IP, they want to change everything about it, and they despise fans like us who liked the show the way it was back in the day. They're dismissed, we're being dismissed as retrograde dinosaurs for liking the show. And so a lot of fans would kind of felt, okay, this is, that's the worst way to endear yourself to us, basically. And it also, I think, put fans on the back foot a bit. Like, they became very, very defensive about the show. And I think that's what fan discussion has been locked into for the last several years. It's been locked into this whole aggressive, defensive arguing the show wasn't sexist or that it was better when it was apolitical. And that's become so much the debating point that the fun has gone from the show. There's no fun debates about the show anymore, I feel. I mean, the reason I think the show went political is to do with the show, what happened to the show in the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, the BBC clearly didn't like the show. They clearly wanted rid of it. They weren't giving it much money. All the standard. We know this. But basically, I think what's not talked about often is what this meant for the fan base. And, specifically the part of the fan base that went on to revive the series in years to come. We had Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat, Chibnall, Paul Cornell, Gareth Roberts, all in the TV industry during the 90s. And they all thought, well, I would love to bring Doctor Who back, but they were very much but they were working in an industry that despised the show, that saw the BBC saw Doctor Who as an embarrassment that was best forgotten back in the 90s. The BBC just thought it was a joke. And on most kind of documentary retrospectives about the show in the 90s, a lot of the time the point was made that, well, one of the less endearing aspects of the show was that it was chauvinistic. The female companion of the Doctor was usually just there to scream and collapse and faint and be decorative and defer to the Doctor as the one in charge.
Why not make some coffee to keep them all happy while I think of something?
All right.
I think there were fans like Paul Cornell definitely felt, firstly, that if the show came back, obviously it's got to aggressively backlash against that. It's got to go against that reputation. It's got to go ultra feminist. The female companion has to be a lot stronger and a lot more feisty. I mean, to a degree, that was happening in the end of the 80s anyway. We got Ace as the companion, who was very much a very post-feminist companion. And Paul Cornell obviously adored Ace, and he kind of, he wrote like a lot of the book. The New Adventure novels were about Ace and the idea that she was the new kind of companion. And, hopefully if we championed her, we could forget the rest of the era. And obviously Chibnall, there was also the idea that, well, if the show's being ridiculed and mocked as not worth bringing back, then what can we identify as a good reason to bring it back? And usually it was because it was a moral show and the Doctor was a moral character. And, so usually in the novels and in the new series, the Doctor would become a far more sanctimonious figure. And there was the idea also that, well, the best way to get the show to be, no one takes the show seriously anymore.
Well, not only that, but it was also very cliched. It was very routine, running up and down corridors and silly monsters.
But if we revive it, we can make it get taken seriously if we make it a more political show. I mean, Russell T Davies injected his politics into the show. We remember, stuff like Aliens of London, World War III, with the business in 10 Downing Street, and all this kind of commentary on the media and Iraq and all this other stuff, and all these right on causes, and of course Chibnall I think it was the same with Chibnall. Chibnall kind of felt, well, the best way to make the show the show does need to prove itself more progressive and feminist. It has to go more post-feminist. And now a lot of the feminists are demanding a female doctor. So let's give them what they want. And in fact, let's go all the way and completely do away with the idea that the doctor was even originally a white male figure. So that's why it happened, I think. It was a kind of reaction to the fact that the show was seen with disdain for much of the 90s. And there was the idea of, let's make the show more sanctimonious. And this, of course, is why Chibnall's era gives us a Doctor who is like the worst, most sanctimonious versions of the Doctor we've ever had in the show. And the problem is it's been pushed to a point where it's just not watchable anymore for a lot of fans. And the thing is, I think the show could still be profitable. It could still be popular if it was doing well. I mean, when the Peter Cushing Dalek movies were released, we got a cinema re-showing earlier this year, they did quite well at the box office. They were in the box office top 10 that week, in spite of the fact they were getting a very, very limited showing. A lot of people went to see them. And I did notice, actually, but in them you had Susan, who was this very intelligent, very brainy child genius, who was very, very cunning as well. She knew how to outwit the Daleks a bit. And, she had she had some very brave moments in the film. Very shrewd moments in the film, She was a very, very intriguing character. She wasn't just she's the girl, she's just secondary to the men. It was, she was an interesting character in her own right. And it was like, this kind of really put paid to the idea that there were no strong female companions in the past. That it was all, it was all about the men. And now it has to be all about the women. No, I mean, Susan was a very, very intelligent character, a very intriguing character. And so it kind of did put paid to the idea, so it kind of put nonsense to a lot of what Jodie had been saying. And this was back in the 1960s. You had this intelligent female character. I really enjoyed revisiting those films. I left the cinema very, very happy. I was really glad I'd revisited them. It's kind of, And then because I was in the town centre, I visited the local Waterstones. And, I just thought, what books have they got lately? And on the list of on the shelf of new releases, they had quite a few feminist books. I don't know why, but I took interest in one of them. This book called In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder. And I started looking through it. It was by this ex-policewoman called Jane Monckton Smith. This stood out to me as a feminist book by someone who actually wasn't just someone who was this wasn't some academic who was just absorbed in theory. This was someone who had lived a lot of the hardships of life. She'd seen firsthand the worst domestic situations. She'd met some of the nastiest men. She'd visited. She'd been on the front lines of this. She'd seen the worst of it. She wasn't detached and in any way attached from the real world. So I had to kind of take this book a lot more seriously than most. I couldn't. It wasn't like a Laurie Penny book, for instance. But I read it, and I have to say, the prologue of the book actually brought me to tears, because in it she describes one of the very first domestics she visited, and she describes in there what domestic abuse and coercive control can do to a victim of it. Like, she'd gone to her first domestic. This was back in the 80s. She'd visited the household, this flat, I think it was. Must have been a flat. And she arrived. There were paramedics already on the scene. There were ambulance staff already on the scene, because this girl had been assaulted by a partner with a lump hammer. He'd whacked her with a lump hammer, and now he'd fled the scene. The paramedics were trying to coax the girl to go to hospital. They were saying, look, you could have a serious life-threatening injury. And the woman just wouldn't go in the ambulance. She just refused to go in the ambulance. She just wouldn't go. They couldn't get her to respond. And you're confronted there and then with what coercive control does to someone. It basically, they're incapable of making independent choices. They're scared to. They're scared to make any decision that might offend their partner. And I think in a horrible way they get used to not making their own choices. And like, I relate to it a little bit because I do have autism. And now I kind of have my own flat, but I have floating support visits just to occasionally give me a prompt to do the cleaning. You need to do this today. You need to do this household task today. You can't just forget about that. You've got to do that. And the reason they have to do that generally is because what sometimes is the case with autistic people is they don't have what you might call executive thinking, which is, the part of the brain that says, you need to do this today. You need to get this done. This is what you do. Just do it. And reading that, I was thinking, this girl, it's like she doesn't have executive thinking. But it's worse in that she's terrorized. She's been terrorized by her partner into not doing the right thing. Into not going, into not seeking help that she might desperately need, that her life might depend on her going in that ambulance and getting to hospital and getting checked out to make sure she doesn't have a life-threatening head injury. I mean, it's tragic to see someone reduced to that. It's horrible. And you never quite know at what point someone ends up in that state, where it's been scolded out of them to have any self-determination, any self-will or independence. The ability to make independent choices just crushed out of them. And the saddest thing is that the book never really follows that up, because it was just one of many domestics she visited, and she doesn't know what happened to that woman. God knows what did. And so yeah, as you can imagine, this was a huge contrast to what I just watched, and it kind of put into perspective, well, we need escapism because the real world can sometimes be a horrible, horrible place in which there are no happy endings, in which good doesn't triumph over evil. Sometimes evil wins. And good people just surrender to this horrible existence. They accept it's their lot. And this is, of course, why we need escapism. We need escapism where we see the doctor, the heroes, save the day, and good win out. Now, the thing is, I would say it was quite a life-changing read for me, because it did start to unravel some of my, I'd gotten along with the anti-feminists on a lot of things, and this was kind of, cold water over a lot of the red pill theory. The red pill theory of, a lot of anti-feminists, especially men's rights activists, have this theory that, we live in a gynocracy in which it's actually the women who have the power. Women are the privileged, protected class, and men are the ones who go and fight and die in wars. They do the dangerous jobs. Men are the ones who sacrifice a lot for women, and men are always the chivalrous ones. They're always protective of women. And they, if a woman cries and demands her way enough times, the men will give in, and that's why feminism is making the gains that it is. And you're reading this book and you realize that that's nonsense. The men she describes in this book are merciless to women, and they assume that they have all the power, and that their female partner, she better do as she's told. I'm in charge. She does as she's told, and if she doesn't, then I feel humiliated by that, and I'm going to take revenge. I'm going to, sometimes it's a beating, sometimes it's murder, sometimes it's a case of I'm going to kill her because I couldn't stand being humiliated in that way. That's how much they believe they're entitled to be obeyed often. And during the course of the book, she interviews men as to why they do, and often it's, well, look, it's important to my reputation in the community that I'm seen as the man of the household who gets his way, and that my wife doesn't, she's not seen to be flirtatious with other men. I keep her under my thumb. She obeys. She acts like a good wife. That's what's demanded. And of course, there are also men who say, well, look, that's what my father was like. My father was violent to my mum, and he was violent to us. So I grew up thinking that's what a man does. A man kind of controls the household violently. And so it's kind of, in a way, she's saying, yes, there are cultural norms about men being in control that inspire men like that to be these monsters, these tyrannical monsters in the household. And I imagine a lot of women absorb that too, and they get the idea in their head that, yes, their role is to be, the agreeable wife who does as she's told. She stands by her man, and she just, she takes it. If he's displeased at her and he kind of tells her she has to comply with what pleases him, she complies. And sometimes she complies to the point where he gets more and more of his way, and she is given up less and less of her esteem. And the worst case scenario, of course, is what we saw in the beginning of that book, where she just is completely subordinated to the point where she's just in this horribly self-destructive state, this dangerously vulnerable state to him. And so again, it's kind of saying that a lot of feminist theory, it's not nonsense. Or at the very least, it kind of gave me the thought that maybe part of the reason why feminism as we know it today is like this irrational, crazy cult, this irrational, crazy, paranoid cult, is maybe in some part because it's trying to identify a shadow enemy. Because with men like this, you never know. You never know when, women kind of meet a man and he romances her. You never know if he's going to turn out to be one of those guys. If one day, he switches, and suddenly he is this controlling monster of the household. And where does he get the idea that that's how you act as a man? It's all about addressing that. And what is it that makes a lot of women grow up with esteem issues that makes them so susceptible to being controlled and subjugated in this way? Now, has Doctor Who ever tackled the issue of domestic violence? Well, for the most part, Doctor Who is an escapist show, so it tends not to. Although obviously in the new series it's tended to look at the domestic sphere a lot more. Too damn much, if you ask me. I like Doctor Who to be a kind of a fun adventure show, not a soap opera, and it's kind of become one in the new series. But occasionally it's done kind of, it's looked at, like Idiot's Lantern and Fear Her are the most on-the-nose examples of this, where they very much are about abusive fathers. The classic series didn't tend to go into that. Very rarely did, but there was a few instances. There was an episode called Kinder in the 1980s where it's set on this jungle planet, and there's a small kind of colony expedition of humans, and one of the members of the expedition team is Hindle, and he's briefly put in charge whilst the commander goes on a reconnaissance mission. And when he's in charge, he starts to go nuts. He's kind of not really adapted to this alien environment anyway. He's very, very paranoid, and basically he kind of becomes this unhinged tyrant on the base, and you could see that he's not well. That he's got a lot of neuroses and some degree of childhood trauma from having a violent father. Now, another example is an episode called The Rescue from 1964. This is where it introduces us to the new companion, Vicky, this young girl from the future. And she's part of this, like, basically she was on a ship that crashed, and a lot of the crew died. Her father died, so she's now orphaned. She's one of the few survivors on this ship, and she is regularly visited by this alien creature called Coquillion, who keeps on making threats, keeps demanding her compliance, and he's been doing this for months. And you do see that in her interactions with Coquillion, her behaviour is very, very consistent with victims of domestic abuse. She's very, very people-pleasing. She's very apologetic.
I bet you never gave them a chance. You could have... I'm sorry.
Remember, I am the only one who can save you from my people. You should be grateful. I am your only protection.
She's kind of just don't hit me today. I'm sorry. I don't want to offend you. Just don't hit me today. And he's very threatening, and he's kind of demanding, her compliance. And he's very, very sinister. And it's the Doctor kind of rescues her from this horrible life. And you do see kind of by the chase, kind of later in the season, she's been with the Doctor, Ian, and Barbara for quite a while at this point, and she's started to come out of her shell as a typical teenage girl of the time, she's a much more spirited, happier Vicky. She revels in the company of the Doctor and Ian and Barbara. In a sense, the Doctor's rescued her from that kind of horrible life. And in some ways, I think it pinpoints that that's the appeal of the Doctor. The Doctor is someone who stands up to tyranny. The Doctor is someone who protects the underdog. And he's an alien who's very eccentric, and he doesn't really care about his reputation. The Doctor is someone who, if you don't get him, you don't get him. But he's this very eccentric character, and he doesn't care if the Brigadier and everyone else thinks he's an idiot or a buffoon. He's kind of he's got that confident self-assurance about him. And so he's not like the men in this book who feel like they have to maintain their rep by doing what they do. And I think because he's an eccentric alien, he kind of revels in the idea, he kind of adores the fact that his female companions tend to be very eccentric humans. They have kind of very human eccentricities. They have very female eccentricities as well. They've very kind of female spirit to them. And the important thing is, the Doctor is not out to crush their spirit. There are very, very rare occasions where you see the Doctor become a controlling tyrant in the TARDIS. It's very rare, but I mean, it's not. I can't say it's never happened.
Get out! Why will you never cooperate?
But for the most part, that's an exception to the rule. The Doctor, for the most part, is a very kind of freedom-loving character, and the companions he has under him, he always places their concerns first. And the companion, contrary to what Jodie Whittaker says, a lot of the time the companions have had some very, very strong, inspiring moments. Like Leela has this great moment in The Sunmakers where she gives this rousing speech to the rebels and talk to them about honor and the fight for dignity. And she basically takes over the scene. It's kind of, at that moment, it's her story almost. She becomes a protagonist in her own right, kind of rallying the rebels. She has more spirit than a dozen of them. It's a very admirable moment, brilliant moment. And Sarah Jane Smith, she had a lot of very, very feisty, fiery moments. I mean, there's this moment in The Seeds of Doom where she's confronted with this very, very sinister mercenary called Scorby. And he's ruthless, he's a nasty piece of work, and he's always threatening them. And he's held them hostage, he's threatening them, and they're all kind of besieged together at this point by the Krynoids. And she basically roars in his face. She tears strips off him verbally, and basically, she kind of scares him off, and he kind of, says, "I'll sod this," and he kind of runs away, and then there's this moment afterwards where you just see her kind of close her eyes with dread, and it's a brilliant moment because that's the moment where she's realised, how the hell was I that brave in the face of him? She's surprised at herself that she was able to be that brave in the face of him. And it's basically, she was scared all along, but she felt the fear and did it anyway. And that was a beautiful moment. And I think for the most part, that is the beauty of Doctor Who at its best, when it was at its strongest, back in the 70s. When it was about taking a stand. When it was about fighting back. When the Doctor would face tyrants like Davros and Morbius, and he would tell them, "You are not going to get your way. I'm going to fight you. I'm going to resist you. We're not going to submit to you. I'm not going to submit to you because I know that nothing good will come of it." And reading that book makes clear that nothing good does come of submitting to tyrants and bullies. They get the misery they want, and the human spirit is a beautiful thing, and the Doctor's like, well, I'm not going to just see it crushed in this way. I'm going to fight back. And more importantly, I think it's also that the Doctor, he believes in the cause of human rights and justice. I mean, in the story Frontier in Space, the Doctor and Jo land in the 26th century. And this is a time when Earth has kind of become this police state. Very paranoid police state, that's facing this impending war with the Draconian Empire. So it's very, very paranoid, tight security. The Doctor and Jo are kind of framed as enemy spies, and they are basically imprisoned. And the Earth authorities tell them, well, we think you're spies for the Draconians. Moreover, we think that you, the Doctor, are the bad influence on Jo. We think Jo's this impressionable young girl, and you're the radical, you're the political one who's basically brainwashed her into kind of following your cause. And so we're going to separate you. We're going to send you to separate prisons. And the Doctor's heartbroken at this. And he does actually say to them, whatever you think Jo has done, you better make sure that she's not subject to any brutal treatment in prison. And she says, we're not barbarians. We're not going to see her mistreated. And that is the core of the Doctor. The core of the Doctor of, everyone has the right to fair treatment and dignity. Human rights matter. And that's a stark contrast to, well, the men you read about in that book who just inflict the worst harm and the worst psychological harm on their partners. And there is the hope that, people watch Doctor Who. When Doctor Who is a popular show that everyone watches, people watch Doctor Who, and maybe some people in that relationship see the Doctor do what a compassionate, caring partner should do. And from that, they kind of understand that's how it should be. And what this relationship I'm stuck in is, it's not right. And I've got to get away.
The Doctor showed me a better way of living your life. that you don't just give up. You don't just let things happen. You make a stand. You say no.
However, there is a double-edged sword to this, which is, as the book describes, a lot of these men, these abusive men, are like the Doctor in one sense. The Doctor is a very anti-authoritarian figure. He's a rebel against the system. He despises authority. He books authority wherever he encounters it. He has no regard for authority. He's a rebel. He's very much anti-establishment. He's a very, very kind of the time, 1960s, 1970s countercultural figure who despises the authorities. And in some sense, abusive men are also anti-authoritarian because, they're criminals. They are, what they're doing is prosecutable. And rightly so. And a lot of these men do instill in their female victim that you have to treat the police and the social services as the enemy and tell them nothing about how I'm treating you. Because they're the enemy. They want to split us up. They want to ruin it for us. We're against them. And because they want to kind of tell me how to live my life. Now, they're not the law here. I am. So that's kind of, and there is the double-edged sword of, well, some might watch that and think, well, yeah, the Doctor's an anti-authority figure, so's my partner, who beats me. And it's like, abusers do weaponize that kind of culture. They're very kind of, certainly in the North, a rather kind of, a working class skepticism toward the police, a working class disdain toward the police, who see them as kind of, the police are class enemies. They're the ones who keep the working class down. And abusive men weaponize that and say, don't trust the police. They're the enemy. They're our class enemy. And so you tell them nothing. And it's horrible. And there is the danger, of course, that some might take that message from the show that, it's, if the Doctor's anti-authoritarian and my partner's anti-authoritarian, then it is right to tell the police nothing. And tell the social services nothing. Now, I like to think that for the most part, the Doctor has been a positive anti-authoritarian figure, anti-establishment figure. Someone who believes that the authorities are fallible and that he can effect better change more efficiently. And that usually whatever he wants to get done, the authorities, the bureaucracies, they're what's in the way. And if he could just get them out the way, then he could get something positive done. And we see that in the Green Death when, the military, global chemicals, they're making things worse and he's trying to make things better. And that's the right kind of message. I mean, to be honest, there was a period in the 1980s where the show just went completely misanthropic and completely nihilistic, in which there wasn't really a positive message to it anymore. It was all kind of soulless. And I dread that we're kind of entering that period again where the Doctor we've got doesn't seem to know suddenly how to fight for what's right anymore. Because the Doctor's so badly written. As we've seen in Battle of Ranskoor Avkolos, it's just as bad as a lot of the 80s stories. Just as bad as the likes of Warriors of the Deep, where the Doctor is hopeless as a hero. The point is, I do think that, there are some positive things to take out of the show. And it was important at one point that the Doctor was a male hero who was a rare kind of male hero who wasn't violent, typically. And who did believe in freedom, did believe in the human spirit and championing the human spirit and championing rebellion against tyranny. And being a nonconformist, defying conformity, defying tyranny, defying, and it was kind of important that he was a male character who was like that, who did buck the trend. And unfortunately, we now live in a time where a lot of these feminist ideologues who are demanding changes to, popular TV shows and franchises, and They just looked at Doctor Who and they had no appreciation for what was positive about the show, what it had to say that was positive, and what was important about the Doctor as a character. And they said, it's a male lead, that's a problem enough, we need to change it, you need to change it. And Chibnall, because he's like I said, he was a fan who grew up in an era where the show has been belittled and it was institutionally kind of looked down on as an embarrassment. He'd forgotten that there was something beautiful about the Doctor as a male role model. He'd forgotten. And now, of course, we have this era now where the magic's gone. The Doctor isn't all that inspiring because it's very, very difficult to believe in the Doctor anymore. And the Doctor of Battle of Ranskoor Avkolos, the one who told Graham that he'd go on the naughty step if he fought, the villain Tim Shaw the wrong way. That's not the inspiring figure that many of us grew up on during the John Pertwee and Tom Baker era, when the Doctor really was a champion against evil. That's a shadow of that. And that's the problem, is that who the Doctor was has been forgotten. And I just hope that whatever happens, whether this new Russell T Davies era succeeds or fails, whether it's make or break for this show, whether the franchise is unsalvageable now, that we never forget it. That we never forget that there was something beautiful. Something beautiful about the show and about the Doctor was true once. Maybe a long time ago. But it was important, and let's not forget it, even if the media itself is forgotten. Because it was cherishable. Anyway, this is Sadako24, signing out.